Hello, I'm Julian, like it says in my username. You might know me as the guy who uploads Jandek songs. In fact, I've uploaded over 50 of them since 2015, probably more than any other channel. So clearly this is music that fascinates me. If you're watching this, I assume it's the same with you. Therefore, this won't be an informational video because I'm sure you've already learned the basics. I'll mention a few sources in a bit and probably put links in the description. Anyway, once I discovered this music back in 2012, it was not long before it totally took over my playlist. This happens with all kinds of artists. When someone just talks about Gorillaz songs for a while, we call that a Gorillaz phase. If the music is conventional enough, we don't feel a need to question someone's tastes. But in some cases, the music is so obscure that our friend's phase needs an explanation. Over the years, this is exactly what I've experienced with Jandek. When my family or friends ask where the fascination comes from, I never have time to put it all in perspective. That'll be the point of this video, to tell the story of a decade that redefined music as I knew it. Just a heads up, I am aware that the singer is technically called the Corwood representative, but for this video, I'll just be referring to him as Jandek. So this really starts in 2010, when I was 16 or so. With a few exceptions, I preferred heavy metal, and to this day, it's the genre I know best. But that summer, I was sent to an arts camp called Apple Farm in South Jersey. The activities are another story altogether, but I became especially friendly with one of the counselors. We talked about all kinds of music, and his tastes were pretty diverse. On the last day, he gave me his computer so I could put songs on my iPod. I went back to Apple Farm the next summer, and my tastes were still branching out by then, so naturally I wanted more songs from that guy. This time I saw a lot of Daniel Johnston in his library, and I was kind of familiar with that. So I took a chance and tried the album Yip Jump Music, which the counselor probably suggested. In any case, those songs really grew on me. The lo-fi production and simple lyrics seemed laughable at first, and it took a while to hear the music as anything more than novelty. But once I did, I couldn't get enough of the raw emotion behind it, and I wondered what else awaited me in Daniel Johnston's catalog. This fascination lasted my entire junior year of high school, and I was willing to pay for those songs. But it was that spring when I wondered, what exactly was outsider music all about? Of course, the internet could answer that, and it showed me other colorful characters, all playing by their own rules. Tiny Tim, Wesley Willis, the Shags. There was even some Canadian elementary school. All of them had their own interesting stories that added depth to the music. To a lesser extent, my interest with them grew the same way it did with Daniel Johnston. However, there was one name that kept popping up, and back then, the first thing I knew about Jandek was that I couldn't pronounce it. I thought maybe it was the name of some Polish dude, but surprisingly he was Texan. And that's about all I found out about the guy. My first taste of his music was from a simple YouTube search, and my random choice was the song Can I See Your Clock? Maybe the dirty sounding name is what drew me in, but I stayed for the guitar playing, which did almost sound like the ticking of a clock. Regardless, it was unlike anything I'd heard before, but I didn't think it would have a big impact on me. The song was simply another piece of my ongoing outsider phase. Maybe a month later, I found the song Time and Space, probably because it was one of the few Jandek tracks you could buy in the iTunes store.
He said, show up wearing either black or white.
It showcased Jandek's bluesy side, which probably appeals to more people. But at the time, it only added to the mystery. How could the dissonance from before evolve into something so familiar? For the time being, I put the question on the back burner. After all, I was still pretty addicted to Daniel Johnston. I gave him a listen every day of my trip to Europe that summer, and barely even thought of Jandek. But then, early in senior year, I quickly entered the fandom. Appropriately, this was pretty mysterious. It was probably just an urge to download more songs, but I'm not sure why I didn't go with Dream Theater or something. Anyway, a YouTube search brought me my next two songs, What Can I Say, What Can I Sing, and Down in a Mirror. Once again, I was sampling Jandek's Dissonant side, but this is when I started hearing the emotion behind it. There was something about the moaning and the monotony that I could relate to, since I was a little depressed that time of year. More songs followed in October, and the lyrics began to stand out. Even Jandek's more beautiful tracks had this really cryptic poetry to go with it. Since I could only guess at the meaning, I often drew different conclusions every time I listened. The mystery didn't end there, because soon I noticed the female vocalist on Nancy Sings.
Clouds fall from your face, shaking the rain in a quiet place.
Not only was this a fresh new take on the Dissonant style, but the mystery behind this Nancy person only added to my fascination. After all, was her singing so impressive that she deserved a spot in the title? Or did the lyrics just not belong there? I guess we're better off not knowing. Anyway, I was also posing the biggest question of all. What the hell is up with the album covers? The pictures all look like throwaways from an old camera. Perhaps the artist didn't want them going to waste? Your guess is as good as mine, but speculation like this is a staple of the Jandek community. As I grew more familiar with this music, I figured it was time to add Jandek to my CD collection. However, I couldn't find any albums at the record store, and keep in mind, it's quite a large one. This music was entering a new level of obscurity, I guess. What came of all of this was probably my first CD ordered by mail, since I had just gotten my first debit card. On Amazon, I decided on White Box Requiem, due to its low price and unfamiliar track list. I vividly remember this because it actually arrived right after Hurricane Sandy hit us. Lo and behold, White Box Requiem really stood out to me with its fragmented lyrics and unique guitar tuning, even compared to other albums. Not to mention, it's apparently a concept album whose themes include things like regret and uncertainty. The titular box also appears in a couple of songs. Anyway, for many artists in my collection, I only have one CD representing them. But not only would there be other Jandek albums, they would be added on a fairly consistent basis. The Rocks Crumble was the next one, arriving 1 month later. I'm not sure, but I may have chosen it for the strange duplication in the track list, with 3 versions of one song and 2 versions of another. My first experience with the album was in the car, and my mom's presence made it unique. It may have been her first experience with this music, since it really started to wear on her that night. Meanwhile, I was appreciating its quirks. After all, this is where I noticed Jandek's habit of redoing certain songs. In this case, we had a version of Nancy Sings without Nancy, but with an equally bizarre title. As for the instrumentation, its evolution was interesting in that the beginning was acoustic, but track 3 brought in the amplifier, and then the drums followed on track 4. This gives much of the album a sort of no-wave atmosphere. No wave is a genre, in case you don't know. Don't confuse it with new wave. I think December 2012 is when I began liking Jandek more than Daniel Johnston, and certain experiences were strongly connected to this music. Around this time was my college visit to Iowa, where those monotonous jams really complemented the flat, dull landscape. Also, my first time hearing Take Me Away With You coincided with a sick day from school, where both my parents and I probably had food poisoning. I kept sampling as many albums as I could, which is how I found the song I Know My Name.
Pain and suffering, anguish is my name. Just call me anything, but I know my name.
This 24-minute beast was my first taste of Jandek's more recent style, where the voice is lower and the guitar's timbre is noticeably different. I should have started with a shorter track from this period because my first experience was in bed. I remember getting impatient at the 15-minute mark since I preferred more graceful music for sleep. So, my third or fourth album was called When I Took That Train, and once I'd given it a fair chance, it still didn't stand out like Blue Corpse or Ready for the House. Now, believe me, there are some real gems late in Jandek's catalog, but it just takes a seasoned listener to appreciate them. If you have a similar struggle, my suggestion is to read the lyrics before listening to the difficult stuff. Come 2013, I was trying to get my hands on every Jandek song the internet could offer, even the recent ones. This tenacity was a mystery at the time. I remember an old friend who was obsessed with a certain anime character, and it made me cringe until I saw the parallel between us. Ultimately, she moved on after that year, whereas here I am making a big YouTube rant. As a shy person in high school, I might have identified with the singer's reclusive ways, but I also saw the value of artistic freedom. From what I knew about him, he seemed to control every aspect of his work, putting him on a separate plane of existence from many others. Anyway, for me, 2013 was a really intense year, defined by graduation and relationship drama, and Jandek was the soundtrack for most of it. With the two girls I dated, I made no secret of my growing obsession, even when I knew it wasn't their type of music. My main instrument at the time was guitar. For a while, I crudely recorded covers of songs I liked. I focused on a few artists, but later on, it was nothing but Jandek. I wasn't sure how to mimic the guitar tuning, so I was forced to write my own riffs on top of the lyrics. If you've heard the Jandek cover albums, it's pretty much the same format there. I remember playing songs like Feathered Drums, Breathtaker, Janky, and Kick. But sadly, none of the recordings have survived. I deleted them from YouTube long ago because I just hated my singing voice that much. As for the albums, they kept coming, even though I still couldn't find any at the record store. In summer of 2013, just before college, the next development in this huge phase was a certain library 30 miles from our house. When I searched for Jandek albums in that county's library system, all of them were in the same place. My dad had the card I needed, so off I went. And just like that, without spending a dime, I had access to several complete albums. I may not have liked all the songs right away, but at least I was able to. Eventually, I also found the album The Door Behind at a Philadelphia shop, which I remember because my ex was with me, and I made her listen when we got to her college. As for my school, I'm pretty sure the only mail I received was a Jandek album or two. But once, I even ordered the old-fashioned way, where you send the payment along with a letter stating which album you want. I don't remember which album it was, but it had to be especially rare since I couldn't find it on Amazon or eBay. After quitting college, something else happened. One day, I was surfing the web in search of songs, and a certain online music store appeared. It looked sketchier than the iTunes store, but what mattered was its abundance of Jandek albums. It didn't have them all, but some of my most sought-after songs were present, like The Electric End. I had to pay for it all, but compared to iTunes, I got a lot of bang for my buck. So much so that over the years, I kept using it for other hard-to-find artists. It only shows how much this kind of devotion can impact the rest of our lives. Back then, when it came to studying Jandek, the first source I found was the documentary Jandek on Corwood. This is where much of the bleak imagery I associate with Jandek comes from. It was also my first time hearing others discuss the music. I got a sense of just how hard it was to reach this guy, so I realized why it took a while for his work to reach a wider audience. While I could always sense something odd about Jandek's guitar, I didn't think it might be untuned until I heard the critics in this film. Their speculation about Jandek's mental health also put ideas in my head. But in general, I liked the varying opinions. Some of the critics didn't have all positive things to say. To potential Jandek fans, the movie is useful to this day, although it's slightly out of date. Keep in mind that in 2003, Jandek still hadn't played live. Plus, it's also easier now to access the music and contact the artist. As a student of quote-unquote Corwoodology, my other tool was Seth Tissue's website. It basically includes a crash course on Jandek's peculiar history and detailed descriptions of each album. There's also a page for many of the lyrics, which was useful in 2013 when I recorded those covers I mentioned. Sometimes I still look at that page for inspiration, since some of the better lyrics act as great poetry on their own. Unfortunately, the website hasn't been substantially updated in over a decade, so I think it's more useful for new fans who have heard the music but started to wonder about it. However, the site does include a mailing list where recent info is shared, and I used it pretty regularly for several years. With heaps of Jandek songs on my laptop, I decided it was better to store them elsewhere. I'd already burned Jandek discs earlier, but in a disorganized fashion. But later it felt more natural to burn whole albums onto discs so that they could fill the voids in my collection. They sure did, because half of my Jandek collection now is just discs with my handwriting on it. More importantly, this habit of burning albums continued with other artists. I like many different bands, and I'm glad to have physical copies of their work in case my computer doesn't survive. It's yet another aspect of my life that can be traced all the way back to a certain hermit from Texas. So in 2014, it turned out I wasn't able to burn every Jandek album. There was nowhere I could download the later albums, and I often found myself checking recent videos on YouTube, usually to no avail. Luckily, around June that year, the Corwood Industries online store was launched. It proved that Jandek could change with the times, and the buying process became quicker than ever. From here, nothing was stopping me from owning the entire library. It was simply a matter of how much money I wanted to spend at once. More and more, I was unable to find the newer records on Amazon, and Jandek's price became the only price. After all, no matter how many times I checked our record store, this stuff was nowhere to be found. Thus began my gradual quest for all of the live albums. In December 2014, I figured I had a lot to say about music, so I set up a blog and began posting album reviews. There were about 10 in the next couple months, but it took surprisingly long for Jandek to appear. Perhaps my obsession had waned a little bit? After all, for a while, I was in a band that offered plenty of distractions from this music. In any case, I had many thoughts about many Jandek albums, so it seemed wise to start at the beginning with Ready for the House. I may have also considered it the most popular release. Nowadays, I would express my views differently, but for the most part, they are the same views. When I meet other fans, or if I just feel like showing off my passion, I still mention this review. The next development was on my old YouTube channel. Summer of 2015 was when I realized there may be others like me who try and fail to get a taste of certain material. I was also having some problems with a certain girl, so I needed a distraction from that. I decided to try my hand at some new video software. It was surprisingly simple, so I gave 5 new Jandek songs to YouTube in the same week. One of those was called What Did I Hear, and it became the most viewed thing I've ever posted. I think that song was best known for its placement in the documentary. From here, several songs were posted sporadically, but I didn't take this stuff seriously until a few years later. Despite growing familiarity with the live releases, the next 2 years were fairly quiet on my end. I met lots of people in this period, and music was always a major talking point. There were occasional attempts to make fans out of them, but it usually just lasted for 1 or 2 conversations. It was a shame because there were all these popular artists that people could casually gossip about without giving a second thought to anything even slightly obscure. Fortunately, it all changed in 2018 as I entered a new phase of Jandek appreciation. In May, I suddenly heard the news of an upcoming show in Queens. As a Jersey boy, I couldn't ask for a better opportunity. Ever since I started paying attention, past concerts were always overseas or way across the country. It definitely bugged me back in 2015 because I even contacted Jandek myself. Despite my inexperience, I asked if we could collaborate for a concert in New Jersey. The surprising response was yes, on two conditions. It had to be in Trenton, and I had to organize it. I got in touch with two potential venues, one of which actually replied. After I told him who I was working with, the coordinator said he'd try moving the plan forward, but I've never heard back. The excitement was intense but brief. We never collaborated, but at least in 2018, I could be in the audience. It started out like many urban shows I went to, refusing to take public transport and getting high after I parked. Once I located the venue, I began chatting about the main act with the only other guest, this rather mysterious girl who was some kind of artist and probably didn't give me her real name. I left for a bite afterwards, and I didn't see her again. I don't even know if she went inside the venue. But once I returned, I was first in line, and others began to appear. I struck up a conversation with a middle-aged Jersey Shore fellow who surprisingly resembled Jandek himself, along with a southern girl who came up there on a bus for various reasons. We were all at different levels in the fandom, but I could tell the guy had come pretty far since he couldn't pick a favorite album when asked. He even loved Daniel Johnston, probably more than me at the time, and this topic ultimately made the girl check out some songs afterward. Anyway, I was in for one more surprise before the show. Jandek and his partner Sheila showed up at the door, the latter of which was already my Facebook friend. She greeted me as we shook hands, and quickly the two went inside to beat the crowd. My new friends and I chose a spot near stage right, with clear views for our phone cameras. Typical rock instruments were used, while Jandek and Sheila performed vocals. She handled the first few songs, and then he finished the job. Unlike some recent concerts, it was only one singer for each song. The music itself was noticeably melodic at times, but didn't abandon the dissonance we come to expect. After 4 songs or so, I realized how exhausted I was. After all, I'd rarely listened to an entire live Jandek album in one sitting. My mind wandered aimlessly with the music until it was brought back to earth with a simple thank you from the singer. Afterward, I apparently had a chance to talk with Sheila some more, but I must have been too tired to stick around. Thankfully, my two friends in the audience had given me their Facebook info. We did talk to another younger guy standing near us, but we never saw or heard from him again. It was a shame because he surprised us with his extensive knowledge of the guy on stage. I don't know if that knowledge surpasses mine, but he seemed to display it more. Regardless, that night proved that concerts could bring me closer to people. There were others before it where I certainly spoke with other fans, but I never followed up with them. This surprising encounter with two awesome people was a development I couldn't have predicted in my early days with Jandek. I haven't seen either of them in a year and a half, and our messages don't get too personal anymore, but you can bet I'll get in touch with it when there's another show nearby. The other component of this new era was the Jandek Facebook group. Without an official page, the fans had to build their own little community, which I discovered in 2015. My first post was a picture of some stranger in black who looked familiar. However, I didn't hit the notification button until the summer of that concert, so that's when the group truly came to the forefront. There would be no more checking the Corewood website for new releases, and no more visiting the mailing list when I was bored. Pretty much everything Jandek related was acceptable here. Not long ago, a guy challenged us to create our own Jandek album art, which blew my mind because I already tried that years ago. Plus, now that this fandom was bringing me friends in person, it seemed that the group was my best tool for getting more. But now, I've just kind of waited for someone nearby to organize a gathering, although I did suggest a Zoom session where we all share our reactions to the latest album. That would have made sense, since many group members are just too far away to come meet me at a show. Speaking of shows, 2019 had barely started when the next one was announced. Taking place nearby in Philadelphia, it would be in a much larger, more traditional concert hall. Me and my Jersey Shore friend bought our tickets early on, but sadly the Southern girl was just too preoccupied for another long trip. The disappointment went away once the action began, of course. The music was preceded by a screening of Kuchen, a short play that's just a philosophical chat between the singers we were about to see. I'd watched it before, but the presence of others did enhance the experience a bit. The concert began shortly afterward, and I immediately noticed differences from the last one. The lack of percussion gave it a certain calmness, while the trumpet added a touch of class. Jandek began on vocals while Sheila tapped on the keyboard, and the roles were reversed midway. Perhaps the highlight of the night, though, was their version of the old folk song, Wildwood Flower. Understandably, this particular rendition bared little resemblance to the one I knew, but its inclusion set this show apart from most of the others. It might have been historic for Jandek, because the last cover song I recall is House of the Rising Sun, over 30 years ago. Back home, my Jandek obsession had found an outlet on my YouTube channel. January of that year was just full of personal issues, and I needed ways to feel better about myself. A few months earlier, I wrote down several lyrics from the Hammond Hall album, resulting in a pretty in-depth knowledge of the music. Nobody had posted these songs to YouTube, so I was excited to be the first. It felt good to share the painting with the world, with its distinct bass line. But the day after, I didn't want the excitement to end. When I browsed the site, I saw that a good chunk of the later albums still weren't represented. I remembered all my time spent checking for new uploads, and realized there might be others in the same dilemma once again. It made sense for me to fix that, because it helps to have previews before deciding on which album to choose. After all, an artist like this won't please every fan with every album. After the painting, there were daily uploads in the next 10 days, while it continued more sporadically in the spring and summer. Over time, I noticed some requests for even more songs from Hammond Hall. Clearly, this had become a popular release, and I'm sure I wasn't the only one analyzing it. Today, I haven't come close to abandoning the vast library of Corwood Industries. In one form or another, I have most of the albums at my disposal, with the exception of the 3 box sets: Song of Morgan, Ghost Passing, and The London Residency. I prefer not to spend over $30 on my music, especially when it's just hours of piano improv. Still, though, I'll continue checking the record store for an unlikely bargain on these or any other albums. This way, I can hopefully replace the burned CDs with official ones. For now, there's more than enough music to keep me busy. It always feels like there's a neglected album I should investigate, and once I give it some love, there's probably a dozen more waiting. Meanwhile, the true classics like 6 and 6, You Walk Alone, and Glad to Get Away, they're my comfort zone. And for the newbies, they act as portals to a strange but exciting world. Well, now we've come to the end. The last piece of this story is what you've been listening to. I was inspired to write this little speech on my recent trip to Missouri. The idea came abruptly, and its purpose was realized as soon as I started writing. Most people I know don't fully understand the role of Jandek in my adult life. To an unsuspecting friend, Jandek is just one of hundreds of artists in my iTunes library, so our time is better spent rocking to the tunes we can agree on. Years ago, I realized I couldn't start a Jandek mania no matter how much I liked the music, and so I was driven underground. All I could do was wait until I crossed paths with even a minor fan, and just make the best of it. Nowadays, I don't feel the need to convert people to the Church of Jandek. When I tried that years ago, I ended up making a mockery of myself and the artist. But is his music the words of an angel or a devil in disguise? I'll just keep listening in hopes of not finding out. If you've made it this far, thank you for hearing my story.